desire to be a safe haven for the Christian community where you can rest in your faith, grow in your faith, and love where God has planted you. So our desire here for you is for this to be a simple and safe place for you to do those things that God calls you wherever He has placed you. Just an update about what's coming up this week. We're having a prayer meeting at 11 o'clock this Wednesday morning here at the church, which is when we would normally have our Bible study. We're going to have a prayer meeting then, and the next day, the Thursday at 7 o'clock, when we normally would have had our Bible study, we're going to have a prayer meeting at 7 o'clock Thursday night. So if you can't make one and you can make the other, feel free to come. If you can't make either, that's fine. But if there's something that's on your heart that you would like the church to pray for, and you can't attend either of those prayer meetings, then you can email me at pastor@norandachurch.com.au, and we'll make sure that we pray for whatever is on your mind coming up. The other thing, just remember, if you have elderly neighbors, to look after them in this heat. Particularly, just make sure that they're okay. I assume you have close relationships with your next door neighbors, and so this heat is horrid. And fortunately, I didn't have to make it out to the bushfires yesterday, but it's just a matter of time before I'm standing in front of a flame in 40-degree heat. It's just the way it is. So remember your firefighters that they stay safe as well. This morning, we're continuing in this series that I started over the course of the summer called Be Wise out of the book of the Proverbs. And yep, we're going to talk about money. Now, just to ease your mind here, because if I'm sitting in your chair and I'm the pastor and I'm listening to the pastor say I'm going to talk about money, and I'm thinking, yeah, the pastor's got his hand in our pocket again. And so I want to disabuse you of any fears that you might have that I'm going to stand up here and tell you what's wrong with you for not giving us more money. That's not what I'm going to do today, so you're going to be okay here. I'm aware of the fact that this church cannot function and operate without the generous giving of the people in this community who give to this church so that the doors can stay open and that we can do ministry here. And that's a necessity that has to kind of happen. And if you don't give and you would like to give, you can do that through an offering box at the back there or through our online giving. And that's the extent of the pitch, right? But today's message is not about how you can make me wealthier as your pastor because I'm not driving a fancy enough car and I'm not trying to build an empire. I'm not trying to do any of those things. We're going to look at wisdom from Proverbs about money and what to do with our money and how to live wisely. The Bible has a great deal to say about money. And some research says there's more than 2,000 verses in the Bible that's dealing with money or property or possessions or finance in some way or business. When you read through the Old Testament and through the New Testament, you'll find that's in fact the case. Jesus spoke freely about money. His primary message was not actually about money. His primary message was about the kingdom, but he used issues of money and business and possessions as metaphors to help people understand what he was trying to get across when he was speaking about the kingdom. And that's not really surprising because money is really important in lives of people and has been since the time immemorial. There is a human tendency that shows up with respect to things in our lives. Because of pride and because of sin, there are three areas in our lives that tend to get distorted: power, possessions, or position, and property or possessions. These three P's tend to become distorted. They tend to become the ultimate idols in people's lives. Now, all of these things in and of themselves are not bad. Everyone needs power and authority and a voice and agency. You need power to operate your life in general. But when power gets distorted by pride and sin so that you becomes coercive and you want to lord things over people and you want to control people and you want to become a dictator and you want to become a pastor of a church or something like that, when power gets out of control, that was a joke. When power gets out of control, then it's a problem. So power is one of those things that the scripture talks about being submissive to one another and caring for one another. The other issue that happens is passion or sex or sexual things are also the kinds of things that can become an idol, that can cause distortions and it can cause troubles. And the third one, of course, is property or possessions. And any of these things get distorted can become an idol. Now, of the three things that they're property of all or possessions of all those things is the most vital for you to be alive, right? Because if you don't have food, shelter, clothing, water, health care, you're going to die. right? It's a basic necessity for life. And so it's understandable that it's going to be at the top of your mind and the top of list of things. In Jesus' day, possessions were really important in the lives of the people. The people were living in what we would today call a third world economy. They were eking out a living hand to mouth. There was no welfare system. So basically, if you could scrabble a bit of a trade together and earn a few shekels that you could pay for food, you would buy bread and maybe some grapes and a little bit of wine and perhaps a piece of meat if you could afford it, and that would last you for the day. And then you would have to work the next day and earn enough money to buy food for that day. And if you didn't have work that day, you didn't eat that day. And so this life was hard, and food security was hard, and there wasn't clean water, and if there was water, it wasn't running in your house. You had to go and get it. And so there was a constant scramble for food and for shelter and for clothing. And so it's not surprising that Jesus said, don't worry about what you should wear and what you shall drink and what you shall eat. Your Father knows you need these things as well as you do, but seek ye first the kingdom of God. So these ideas, the need for possessions and property, God knows our need for these things, and they're important things. And Jesus recognizes our need for these things, and he is saying that the kingdom matters more. And that was his point. But he used these ideas of property and possessions all the time because they're at the forefront of a third world person's mind. And these people were effectively what we would call third world people. So what I want to do this morning is I want to go through the book of Proverbs and just pull some of the Proverbs out and gain some wisdom about property, about possessions, about money and what we do with it, and how we to approach it from a wisdom perspective. And I want to start with this one here. This is what I'm calling the sweet spot. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that I need, or I shall be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or I shall pour and steal and profane the name of my God. And so this is wisdom literature. And so what it's saying right at the outset here is that there is this sweet spot where you are looking for your needs to be met, not to such an excess that you turn your back on God, or not to such a limit that you turn your back on God. And what this proverb is highlighting is that there is a serious spiritual impact on our lives when it comes to our relationship to money and possessions. An imbalance in these things can have dire spiritual consequences. The value we place on money and possessions is a barometer of our spiritual health. And you see a similar kind of teaching by Jesus in the parable of the soils or the seed, where he mentions the seed falls in three places. It falls on hard ground and it doesn't grow. It grows on shallow soil and it doesn't thrive. And then it lands on good soil, but it's surrounded by thorns. And in the words of Jesus in Matthew 13:22, what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world, that is, I have too little, and the lure of wealth, I have too much, choke the word and it yields nothing. And so there is this kind of sweet spot that wisdom says is the place that you should be looking for. That if you have too little, it's okay to have enough. And if you have too much, this is a poor place to be as well. And that there's real wisdom in having just the right amount. So the questions that I want to ask here is, how do humans flourish with respect to money and possessions? Because too much is clearly not flourishing, but either is too much. And that's what the Bible is trying to tell us and what the wisdom literature is telling us. We think that getting lots of stuff is good, but instant wealth is a curse, and chasing it is foolishness. This is what the wisdom literature is telling us here. Now, I want to say right from the outset, and I said this last week, and I want to highlight it again, none of this is law. No one is telling you what to do here. This is the user guide of the manual for the piece of equipment that God has called human life, and he's saying, this is the way I've ordained things to work. The wisdom that's woven into the system looks like this. And so if you abide by this wisdom, things are more likely to go better for you than if you don't abide by this wisdom. And so if you're going to chase after wealth, it's highly unlikely that it's going to go well for you. But if you gather it little by little, this is the way God has ordained the world to work. If you play the Powerball lottery, which you are perfectly free to do, you have a 1 in 134.4 million chance of winning. So just so you know what that looks like, if you play it today, you could win today. The odds are just as good as you winning it. But 1 in 134 million means that if you play it once a week, one game once a week, you will guarantee to have won sometime between now and 2.6 million years from now. That's the odds of winning Powerball lottery. Okay, so no one just buys one ticket. That's why they get you to buy 10, which means, therefore, the chances of you winning are 1 in every 250,000 years. Or if you get 100 tickets, 1 in every 25,000 years. Or 1,000 tickets, once in every 2,500 years. It's ridiculous. The probability of you winning is so small that statistically it's 0. And yet people seeking the hasty gain of lottery. And it's true, someone has to win. But the problem is, what happens when you do? If you want to curse your enemies, give them a winning lottery ticket. And that sounds paradoxical, but it's the reality of what happens here. There's a thing called sudden wealth syndrome, where people feel guilty that they were the ones who won the lottery in face of astronomical odds. It's a term given to a psychological condition where the overwhelming pressure of unexpected and or abrupt fortune can develop into emotional and behavioral afflictions. Recognizable signs of developing or having developed SWS include isolation from former relationships, paranoia of losing the money, guilt, and the uncertainty or shock due to unexpected nature of their fortunes. You see what happens. You're working for a living, you're working for a crust, you're eking out a living, you win $132 million. You tell your boss where to go, you buy all this stuff, you live it up like a grand person for a year, and then you are bored stiff. Boredom is really something that happens, because now I actually have no reason to live. I got all this money, what am I going to do with it? I don't even know what to do with it. People who have this SWS see a sudden influx of challenging emotions can cause an individual to adopt self-destructive behaviors, which includes isolating themselves from relationships, because now you don't trust anybody. Sandra Hayes of Missouri split a $246 million jackpot with several co-workers in 2006, but soon found that certain acquaintances were more interested in her assets than her friendship. She said that when she dined out with her friends, they would belatedly announce that they didn't have enough money to foot the bill. You can afford it. You won all this money. You have $246 million. When Denise Rossi won a $1.3 million jackpot in 1996, she abruptly decided to divorce her husband without telling him about the prize money in order to keep it all to herself. Her plot backfired 3 years through a court when a court ordered her to transfer every penny of her winnings to her ex-husband. And one Pennsylvania man, William Post, won $16.2 million in 1988 and was pursued by a hitman hired by his brother who hoped to inherit a share in the winnings. And many cases in the United States now with the lottery, they don't actually publish the name of the winner anymore. They used to, except the first time someone won a big prize pool, someone went and kidnapped his son. And so now they don't publish your name because it's dangerous. Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. It doesn't always go bad for people who win lottery, but 70% of the people who win lottery go bankrupt. There's a proverb that says, better is a fool and his money are soon parted. Isn't that the comment? Because we just don't know what to do with this kind of wealth. It destroys us. We're not prepared for it, and we don't actually need it. Quick gain destroys friendships, families, and communities. Many lotto winners just end up squandering their money into bankruptcy. Proverbs 1:19 says, such are the paths of all who go after ill-gotten gain. Now, the lottery is not ill-gotten gain. I'm just not understanding here. But the point that it's making is just chasing after the riches. It takes away the lives of those who get it. This is just wisdom and saying, if you're chasing after the big lottery winnings, that's not the wisest way to think about getting your wealth. There is a sweet spot for our money and our possessions. And all who go and a wisdom seeks that sweet spot, not too much and not too little. And that chasing after too much quickly is foolishness. And then there is this. Because what Proverbs tells us is that this slowly gaining it bit by bit through hard work and diligence, this is God's wisdom. God built this into the system. This is the way it's supposed to work. Work from God is a blessing. Lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Here's another one. Go to the ant, you sluggard, and consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. Now, the point to recognize here is that not everyone who is poor is lazy. Don't make that mistake of understanding what this proverb is saying. What it's saying is people who are lazy will end up poor. But just because you're poor, it doesn't mean you're lazy. There is no shortages of reasons why people are in poverty. There's a range of social and systematic economic factors which are often the reason that people get trapped in poverty cycles. Some of the policies enacted by the states, some states in the United States, were deliberately designed to ensure that black people were disenfranchised from the economy. And then they were poor. This is not because they were lazy, it's because they were not given jobs. That's a different thing entirely. There is such thing as working poor, people who work 3 jobs and still can't pay the rent. And not because they're spending it on beer and cigarettes, it's just because they can't earn a decent living enough to pay the rents because the economy is what it is and the cost of things is too high. So we have to be careful to not read that proverb and say that poor people are poor because they're lazy, but just saying that the reason that lazy people will end up poverty because God has designed it for people to work with their hands to earn what they need for this life. Work is not the curse. It's what we've done with it that's the curse. In Genesis in chapter 1, God, well before the fall, calls Adam and Eve to work the garden. Meaningful work is not the curse. It's the lack of meaning in work that's the problem. The point is that blessing from God, it is a blessing from God to have meaningful employment. And it is the grossest of injustices when an economic system has become so distorted that people cannot find meaningful work. I can tell you from my own personal experience that it was the lowest parts of my life when I was 4.5 years unemployed. Right? It's a terrible experience. And others who just cannot find work. Work is not the curse. It's the dysfunction in our workplaces that is evidence of the curse. It's working like slaves for little to no reward that cannot meet your needs. It's being exploited by greedy bosses or control-hungry union shop stewards. It's doing something that's beneath your education and skill set. When you know you're gifted for more and able to give more, but no opportunity exists for you to do it. There are people in this country who are driving cabs, which is a meaningful and reasonable job, and it's an ethical thing to do, but they're actually trained doctors in another country. But when they came to this country, their education was not sufficient for them to be able to operate as a doctor, and they can't afford to do the training to become a doctor. And so you have doctors and lawyers and very high educated engineers and professionals doing tasks that are beneath them because the economic system and the rules in the country require them to do something. That's where the curse lies. It's not in work itself. When the economic system is set up to chew up the little guy for the sake of the guys at the top, that's the curse, not the work itself. We should be seeking a sweet spot for our money and possessions, and wisdom seeks it. And the chasing after too much too quickly is foolishness. And wealth gained by meaningful work is a blessing from God. Now, this is a really important thing to get here because it's possible for you to sit in churches and for pastors to stand here and kind of make you feel guilty that you've retired well, if you've retired well, or that you live in a comfortable home or have a new car. But the fact that God has blessed you with work and ability to do the work and has remunerated you well so that you can live the life where you fall in that sweet spot, but between not too much and not too little, that's entirely a blessing from God. And so if you've worked in such a way that you're now able to retire and have what you need, that's a blessing from God. And you ought to rejoice that God has given you that great opportunity to do those things. This is the way that God has worked the system. In Proverbs chapter 16, verse 8, better is a little with righteousness than large income with injustice. The point here is that chasing after the biggest wage, if that's what you're seeking, can often lead to injustice. If you can earn or do earn a good salary or did earn a good salary to meet your family's needs, it's a blessing. But it's better to have an income that meets your needs to live comfortably than to be chasing after the next job with the bigger wage, and in so doing, the injustice is the cost. Which is telling you that as Christian people and as people who want to live wisely, we need to be thinking about the other guy when we're thinking about ourselves. For instance, imagine for a moment that you take the job of a guy who's making more than you because he's got a position of managerial and you wanted the manager position and the power and prestige that comes with it. Even though you were doing okay on your income, he's got 7 kids, is now unemployed. You got his job and you got the prestige and the power and the money, and now you can buy a bigger house. But the means by which you did it was by white-anting him to get there. This is not an uncommon thing that happens in businesses and in companies. This is the point. What is the point? Where is the value in more when it comes at the cost of injustice? All these proverbs about flourishing, communities flourishing, and not just individuals flourishing, because it isn't just about you. It's about the community and the social good and the common good. And so this is the picture that you're wanting to have. And so if we're going to be people who want to follow after God, we want to be thinking about not only are my needs met, but what is the impact of me on others? This sounds awful Marxist, awful progressive, but it's the reality of what God is calling us to think about the other. Love neighbor as self. But aren't some jobs just beneath us? Isn't just some work beneath us? Okay, sure, God has given me work through my hands and I can produce food or I can buy meals for myself. And the reformers back in the 1500s and 1600s gave this idea to the idea of the Protestant work ethic. And what they were trying to do is to revalue or redeem work within the context of the gospel. Luther was the big one with this. And he said basically that work, the simplest hands that work are the fingers of God. God is loving you and doing things through the work of other people. Right? So imagine the fishmonger who's cleaning your fish for you. Is he here? He's not here today. Well, he cleans fish for you. Now, you seem like it's pretty a menial job. Yet, that's a really important job. It blesses me that someone is in the community who's skilled enough, able enough, and ready enough to clean fish so that I don't have to because I'm not good at it. There's blessings that God blesses us by blessing others to do things in the culture, even the simplest things. That's how God cares for his creation. He dignifies us by enabling us to do even the simplest of things. You might think that, cleaning floors is meager. Yes, but it's a benefit to everyone else when someone cleans the floors. There is no unsanctified jobs. All jobs, according to Luther, therefore, are sacred. And earning well enough to meet our needs by doing simple things is a great blessing from God, and we ought to see it that way. But as Christians, the decisions about the type of work we do and the way we do it and our attitude to it is changed when we view our work and our income we receive as a gift and a blessing from God. And that's the way the gospel starts to change what we think. And I said this a few weeks ago. Paul says that we are transformed by the renewing of our minds. And he says that all things are made new. And the things that are made new is our perceptions. The way we perceive the world starts to change. And so we want to align our lives underneath the wisdom that God has built into the system. And so the sweet spot for our money and our possessions, there is a sweet spot and we should seek it. And that chasing after too much too quickly is foolishness. And that wealth gained by meaningful work is a blessing from God. And the work we do is meant to be a blessing to others. And finally, both the work and the income we received can help us to be generous. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. You have heard this 1,000 times in a much more simpler way. You are blessed to be a blessing. You are not an island. You are in community. There are others around you. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the way God has built the system to work. And so if you're prepared to be a generous person, you will prosper. By refreshing others, you will be refreshed. It's better to give than receive, right? The giver gets the gift. This is the common kind of language that we think about this kind of thing. God has given us a work to bless us and to be a blessing. But let me ask you a question. If I had $100 and gave it to the church, to the Noranda church, Would that be generous? Some might say yes, some might say no. Okay, what if I had $1,000 and gave it to the Noranda church? Would that be generous? Some more might say yes, a few less might say no. All right, let's say I had $100,000 and I gave it to the Noranda church. Would that be generous? Now most of you, okay, now you're generous, okay. But what if I told you that I had $50 million in the bank and I gave you $100,000? Would that be generous? Well, maybe not as generous until a minute ago, that I thought a minute ago. And what if I told you that the $100 I gave to the church was the last $100 I had and I sold my shoes to give it to the church? So what that's saying here is that generosity is very subjective. And it's got to do with the cost of the gift. And so when the Proverbs say to be generous, what generous means for you and what generous means for you and what generous means for me is going to be entirely different. And the means by which you determine what is generous is up to your own personal circumstance and conscience and your relationship with God and not me. That's not my call to tell you if you're generous or not. That's your business. That's the business that you hold with God, whatever generosity looks like. And so I thought a little bit about generosity, and what I want to think here is, first of all, that in order to be generous, generosity is an attitude of the heart. Ultimately, it's an attitude of the heart. We want to be generous-hearted people so that you're naturally inclined to be a magnanimous person. A magnanimous person. Animus means life, and magnum means big life. So a magnanimous person is a person who's big with their life and big with what they have and just give and give and give. You want to become the kind of people that are generous kinds of people. So what does generous look like? Because you are promised that you will be refreshed by being generous. And since God has given us, most of us, those of us, work and an ability to work and has given us blessings to be a blessing, what does that look like to be generous people like that? What is the wisdom literature saying here? And so I want to think a little bit about something here. Wow, we took off like a rocket. Everybody in this room, it's disappeared. Okay, I'll just fast forward. There. Everybody in this room has time, talent, and treasure. Everybody. But you have it all in different measures. Some of you, because you're retired, have far more time than someone who works full time because their time is consumed with doing the work. So you have less time than others, but everybody has time, and you have to determine what you do with your time. Everyone has 24 hours a day, 168 hours a week. We all have time, and we all have to decide what to do with it. Everyone has talent, and talent includes abilities, capabilities, capacities, gifts, whatever. Some of you are good at sewing, some of you are good at cooking, some of you are good at engineering or computer science or whatever you're good at. We all have talents and skills. Some have far more, some have far less. It's on a scale, but we all have it to some measure. And we all have treasure. That is some resource at our disposal. Tools, a house, a church, money, health would be a treasure. And some of you have very, very low health talent here, but you have treasure in other ways. And you have to combine all that stuff. All of us have these kinds of things. And so to be a generous person means that I give from my time, or I give from my talents, or I give from my treasure, and I do it in a magnanimous way when I can, because I will be refreshed when I can do it. But let's just stick with the treasure, the money part, because that's the bit that really bugs us. And in order to be a generous person, what does that look like? And so there's three little things that I've skewed up here, and this is highly confusing, but I'll simple it down. The very top little graph is got to do with expectations. And there, in the red zone is the healthy expectations about life. Some people have unhealthy expectations because they're too high. Some people have expectations of life because they're too low. But the person that has high expectations is the person that's entitled, the entitled person. So they have an expectation that I should be able to live in a mansion in Applecross with a Lamborghini, and everybody should be able to live like that. I have that expectation, and I am entitled the best of the best all the time. And if I have too high expectations, if my expectations have gone off the chart that way, it's going to be very hard for me to be generous because I haven't got anything to give, because I'm saving it all for my Lamborghini, right? But does everyone have a right to a Lamborghini? I mean, one might fall in your lap. It's a different story. But this is about what you expect from life, this sense of entitlement. The second is when my supply, whatever that supply is greater than or equal to what I need. The shalom spot is that I have plenty of food, I have plenty of water, I have plenty of shelter, I have plenty of clothes, I have good health care and education if I needed it. And I have all that I need for those kinds of things. So when my supply is greater than my need, I can be more generous than when my supply is less than my need. It's not to say I can't be generous when my supply is less than my need, but when my supply is less than my need, that's very generous because that becomes the widow's mite. You give what you don't have. That becomes the ultimate definition of generosity. But if I want to be a generous person, then I have to just have reasonable expectations about what does it mean to live a comfortable life in this world. And the community you live in, and the culture you live in, and the society you live in, with its consumerist bent, is convincing you that you should expect far more than you actually need. Right? We buy into this, that the 4-bedroom, 2-bath house is not good enough because it doesn't have a swimming pool. I need a swimming pool. And not only do I need a swimming pool, I need a boat. And I need all these things. Well, you don't need it. It's nice to have. And if God blesses you with these things, and it's a different thing. But when you're chasing after this stuff because your expectations are too high, then your generosity goes down because you just haven't got the supply to meet the need that you think you have to need. I did this exercise years ago. You might remember, you guys. I counted how many shirts I have. I have 73 shirts. Of all varying different kinds, t-shirts, work shirts, business shirts, just kind of casual shirts, exercise shirts, 73 shirts. Do I need any more shirts? I have 6 pairs of boots. Do I need any more boots? You see what happens when your expectations for what you think you need to be happy to live get off the scale, then your supply is never going to catch up to your need and you can never be generous. This is the point I'm trying to make here. And the last thing is about anxiety. Don't worry about what you're going to eat and what you're going to drink. That kind of anxiety or fear that somehow God is not going to meet my needs. All I have is this $20. I'm going to keep it in my pocket because what if I need this $20? And, how did you get it in the first place? Well, God gave it to me, and then He'll probably give you another. Right? But it's this fear and anxiety, and it's the fear and anxiety and the cynicism associated with it. So you're walking down the street and somebody wants your money. Can you give me money for food? And you don't give it to him because he's going to spend it on beer. Right? So there's that cynicism that causes you to have this idea that someone's out to get you or out to hoodwink you or take from you, or your fear that God is not going to meet your needs or whatever. But when my anxiety is natural and healthy, I should be careful about who I give my money to. There's wisdom in that. And I shouldn't be too anxious. My expectations for the basic things for shalom, I don't need 100 shirts. So I don't need any more shirts. And my supply is meeting and exceeding my need. I can afford to be a generous person. And that's what generosity looks like. And so we can be these kind of generous people when we're prepared to give from the excess that God has given us, rather than holding it in for ourselves. Now, this has a real meaning here. When my expectations are right, and my supply is equal to my need, and my anxiety is healthy, the word for those things is content. I'm just content. And so if I can stop and take measure of my life and say, I'm pretty content here, then I'm prepared to be the kind of person that operates with generosity. And there's wisdom in that because I receive a reward for being generous that way, but I'm blessed to be a blessing to others. So the community is rewarded by that. So what generosity looks like for you, that's your business. I'm not here to tell you what that looks like, how much generosity, how generous you can be. If you're struggling to meet your basic needs, and your expectations are healthy and normal, but you just haven't got the sufficient food or sufficient clothing or sufficient those kinds of things, it would be the worst kind of injustice and travesty for me to stand up here and say, you need to give money to the church. The church needs to give money to you. That's the way it's supposed to work. If the church's needs are being met and exceeded, it's not supposed to be, I'm taking money from the poor. That's not how it's meant to work at all. There's one practical application I want to say here, and then we're going to finish. Because I'm about to be confronted with this. Michelle and I are about to be confronted with this. You know I was going to say this. There are men in this room and women in this room who have houses full of stuff you don't use and will never use ever again. But you keep it out of fear or anxiety, or maybe because of sentimental reasons, sheds full of stuff that your kids are going to have to clean out for you one day when you drop off the perch, which could happen tomorrow. And so rather than holding on to this stuff, you could be really generous with it and find a way to give it to someone who can use it now. And then you receive the joy and delight in knowing that, hey, so I've already got plans for my library to make sure that when it gets to the point where I can't use that library anymore, to give it to the seminary so they can give it to a pastoral student, right? Because that's the thing you need to. So if you're at that stage now where you've got a shed full of stuff that hasn't burned down yet, if you've got a shed full of stuff and you are ready, then think about what you don't actually need, because your supply is more in advance than your need, and your expectations as you get older need to narrow down. I don't need all that stuff anymore. And I don't have to fear that God isn't going to meet my needs, because he's met my needs all my life and we're doing okay here. Let me give away all this stuff because it's just gathering dust. And then I get a blessing from being generous that way. So that's my encouragement to you guys, because we're faced with a shed full of tools and other stuff that we're going to have to figure out how to give away. Yeah, that's disappeared. It's disappeared. My supply is not equal to my need here. So that would be a huge cost. Okay, so this is what I want to say about. So the whole point about all this is that God has given wisdom through the text about how to approach our finances and our money in such a way that we're not the kind of people who are chasing after stuff that we don't need to chase after and hoarding stuff we don't need to hoard, and that there is a blessing for us and the community when we live lives of generosity. I pray that God will help us to be more sensitive to our own foolishness in our finances. Father, I thank you that you have given us these words through a wise person who's lived and experienced the truth of these things. Father, help us to find that sweet spot where we have our needs met and can revel in the blessing that you have given us in these things, and help us to be generous with what we have in excess so that we might be a blessing to others, we pray. Amen.